This is the World Organic News for the week ending 18th of June 2018. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. A quick point to kick us off this week from the Mercury News. Pre-cut melon linked to Midwestern Salmonella outbreak. Quote, from the Associated Press, Springfield, Illinois. Health officials say a Salmonella outbreak linked to pre-cut melon has sickened 60 people in 5 Midwestern states. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says Cato Foods LLC on Friday recalled pre-cut watermelon, honeydew melon, cantaloupe, and fruit medleys containing at least one of those melons that were produced at its facility in Indianapolis. End quote. That this sort of thing continues to occur should raise more than eyebrows. Food poisoning, given the HACCP, Hazard Assessment Critical Control Point system, a system developed to make food poisoning on the Apollo missions impossible. Food poisoning should not happen. Now, I'm not silly enough to assume everyone will follow the rules. There are costs involved in HACCP and therefore shortcuts or deliberate fraud will occur. However, the longer the supply chain, the more opportunities for error or fraud there are. So a rather obvious response is to shorten supply chains. Shorter supply lines lead to seasonal eating. I know, how could we possibly survive without a year-round supply of avocado? First world problems. As it turns out, we can actually survive on seasonal food. Marks the turning of the year, connects us with our food producers, and is, probably, healthier for us. The foods in each season being constituted in a way that better supports our health at those times. We evolved as seasonal eaters, and that's about as paleo as I get. We now come to a delightful little post from Truth's World entitled Symbiotic Farming. Using sheep to graze weeds on coffee plantations found to be beneficial economically, agriculturally and environmentally. This is about a research project in Veracruz. Quote, the researchers turned to Pelibru sheep, a breed of domestic sheep native to Mexico and the Caribbean. These hardy animals are primarily raised for their meat since they're unable to grow wool. Around 32 male lambs were utilised for the study, which took place in the municipality of Campana in Veracruz, Mexico. There, the researchers carried out their 40-day study before coffee was scheduled to be harvested from a local plantation. End quote. The upshot was sheep can work well within coffee plantations. Extra natural fertiliser, which means, of course, a possible E. coli source. I would think removing the sheep for a month prior to harvest would overcome this point of contamination. The post goes on to list 4 other uses for sheep in non-traditional settings. 1. Wildfire prevention. Sheep can graze fuel loads on difficult-to-access areas, converting a potential hazard to meat and fibre. 2. Improving tree plantations. This has a fire hazard reduction benefit as well as keeping the landscape clean and providing fertiliser for the growing tree crop. This has to be coordinated with tree size and resilience, but it's an obvious use. Number 3. Enhancing plant biodiversity. Areas under rotational sheep grazing regimes tend to have higher plant diversity than those that don't. The sheep are constantly creating the conditions for plants to grow, such as that one species cannot dominate. 4. Cattle pasture weed control. Sheep will eat things cows do not. This is a variation on the plant diversity idea, and sheep traditionally followed cattle in rotations, so this is a back to the future idea. I like sheep and therefore I'm subject to bias confirmation in this area. Objectively though, they have many uses other than on straight pastures. There are so many breeds that we do not need to stick to the harder to fence, highly producing breeds. Texels and Suffolks and so on grow quickly and produce a relatively low-fat meat, but there are other options. Shropshires and Rylands are far more docile, slower growing but with excellent flavour. I've worked with Shropshires before and they fit perfectly into an orchard situation for part of the year. They fatten even in drought years and are perfect for the small holder as they can be trained to follow a bucket of concentrates and you don't need a sheepdog. Another breed I've kept is Dammers, a self-shedding, extremely low-maintenance breed that eat like goats but behave as the sheep that they are. They will stop blackberry growth dead over a season. They forage as well as graze and do nothing but good for pastures. Think about sheep, especially for a small holding, and think creatively. Creative thinking, or thinking counter to popular opinion, is the subject of our next post from the Applied Ecologist blog entitled Crop Rotations Called into Question. Crop rotations have been a foundation idea for organic farmers since the Fertile Crescent first suffered under a plough. Quote, run since 2004 on the experimental farm of Ghent University in Mel, central Belgium, the assumption that plants used in rotation are non-hosts for the focal crop's pests is not met in this experiment. The aim of this specific trial was to test the long-term effects of compost amendments on the soil quality and crop yield. In this trial, 4 crops belonging to 4 different families are grown every year in the following rotation: potato followed by Italian ryegrass catch crop, fodder beet, maize and Brussels sprout. Despite this diverse rotation, the yield of the fodder beets has plummeted since the start of the trial. In particular, the biomass produced by fodder beets in plots without extra compost is a third less than it was 14 years ago. End quote. This is science as it should be. Test an hypothesis and measure results. This may be a fodder beet specific result, but it may point to the need for compost rather than rotation. I have some years ago run an anecdotal test and grew the same species on the same garden plot for 3 years, adding goat shed bedding twice a year. The bedding consisted of spilt lucerne hay, oaten straw, urine and droppings. My reasoning was that with that much goodness added, it wouldn't matter from a plant nutrient viewpoint if I continued to not rotate. I experienced no disease effects, which is another reason given to rotate crops. The sample was small, the organic matter top-up was high, so maybe crop rotation is another idea that is assumed but not actually needed. Maybe. The yield drop in the test case quoted was due to fungal rot disease. Organic matter may be protective against fungal disease. Certainly it was the recommended defence against Phytophthora when I was studying horticulture. The thinking was with enough organic matter, healthy fungal organisms would outcompete the Phytophthora over a number of years, and it seemed to work. My takeaway from this study is that we need organic matter more than we need crop rotation, and we need no-dig systems as the baseline for protecting our fungal systems developed in agricultural horticultural systems. And now to our final post this week. From Kevin's Walk on the Wild Side. Is Australia's current drought due to climate change? It's complicated. Quote, so are droughts getting worse, and can they be attributed to climate change? Drought is a complex beast and can be measured in a variety of ways. Some aspects of drought are linked to climate change, others are not. End quote. This seems fair enough to me. To quote further from the piece, quote, much of southern Australia is experiencing severe drought after a very dry and warm autumn across the southern half of the continent. Australia is no stranger to drought, but this recent dry spell and Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's visit to drought-stricken parts of the country has prompted discussion on the role of climate change in this event. Turnbull said that farmers need to build resilience as rainfall appears to be getting more variable. This prompted former Nationals leader John Anderson to warn against politicising the drought by invoking climate change. This in turn was followed by speculation from numerous commentators about the links between climate change and drought. End quote. The authors then go on to describe the various ways drought can be both defined and measured, from the simple rainfall deficiency to increased sunshine, lower humidity reading, warmer temperatures and so on. The point is, drought is complicated and not especially well understood in its causes. The effects are more than obvious. This makes attributing a particular drought to climate change difficult, but we do have some longer-term trends, particularly in the southern half of the continent. This is usually described as having a Mediterranean climate, with more rainfall falling in winter. In the southwest, the data is fairly clear that this rainfall pattern is changing to one of less rainfall and less predictability. In the southeast, the variation from year to year is still greater than that which would appear to be driven by climate change. A conclusion? Well, yes and no. Climate change is definitely responsible for some trends. It may be responsible for others. In a land of drought and flooding rains, it might not be obvious if a particular drought event is part of the El Nino-La Niña Pacific Ocean temperature cycle or not. Probably best to be planting drought-resistant fodder crops, such as an insurance policy. Things like saltbush, Tagasasti, Currajong and so on. Buckle up, people. Things are, I'm afraid, going to require a lot more adaptation than we have planned for. And with that, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Now, as a podcast listener, and you've made it to the end of this podcast, which is a sign you're thinking about producing your own anyway, but you're not sure where to begin, drop over to mrjohnmoore.com, link in the show notes, and pick up the free checklists I've written to help get you started. I'm also doing live presentations twice a week and putting them up as podcasts to help you through the process. Details are at the Facebook page Podcast Like a Pro, link in the show notes. A transcript of this episode is available at worldorganicnews.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.